Hello, my name is John Ryan from the University of Western Australia. This paper is an initial attempt to think through how some of the ideas catalyzed by the new field of critical plant studies, or what I'll refer to as CPS, might enhance, illuminate, or challenge aspects of climate change discourse. Pictured in the middle of this slide is Cassia fistula, the national tree of Thailand, flowering in brilliant yellow during the hot April days of Songkran, the Thai New Year. And here's another summer blossom, although of a different continent, the Western Australian Christmas tree, Nutsia floribunda. This is a fascinating hemiparasitic tree that's recently become of international interest as an indicator species for climate change. By highlighting the sensitivities of plants such as Cassia, Nutsia, and all others, great and small, CPS calls attention to the need for models of plant ethics. Such models would counterpoise tendencies to treat, conceive of, and categorize plant life as mute material for human consumption or for so-called ecosystem services. I suggest that while bringing the intrinsic rights of plants to the fore, CPS can also trigger the restructuring of discourse, leading to new stories that can be told about plants and climate change. Hence, rather than focusing on ethics, I'll attempt to postulate how discourse itself might shift to reflect and come to be shaped by the botanical world. In addition to the title question, what can critical plant studies contribute to climate change discourse, I also want to ask the following. Considering plants both as primeval sources of carbon and as modern carbon sinks, that is, as beings inextricably linked to our survival, why do they seem to languish in the background of the stories we tell about climate change? Do they languish? Has there been a failure to narrativize plants, leaving a gap like this one found in an old-growth Australian eucalypt tree? Considering the vast terrain of what's included in climate change discourse, from science and politics to fiction and film, I'll limit the scope to narratives and, more specifically, to climate change poetry, through a recent example titled Keep It in the Ground. Curated by British poet laureate Carol Ann Duffy in 2015, this online anthology of climate change poetry was published over 20 consecutive days in the British newspaper The Guardian. As the slide indicates, well-known actors including James Franco and Jeremy Irons recited the poems, lending greater public impact to what was essentially a narrative campaign. The Australian bird orchid pictured here on the left will set the agenda. The presentation begins with some of the current ideas about the interrelationship between plants and climate change, before addressing recent developments in critical plant studies. I then turn attention to climate change narratives in poetry through the Keep It in the Ground campaign, including a very brief look at poems by Carol Ann Duffy and Alice Oswald. The discussion concludes by posing 5 ways I think CPS might recast public narratives by greening climate change discourse. While the impacts of climate change on plants are well documented, other research has pointed to the resilience of botanical life in response to climatic disturbance. A University of Minnesota study indicates that plants acclimate to a warmer climate and release only 1/5 as much additional CO2 than scientists previously believed. Researchers at the University of Copenhagen have postulated that plant gases, or biogenic volatiles, can slow the increase of atmospheric temperatures in Greenland. Increasingly, it appears that part of the challenge for us is to become allies with plants within co-constitutive relations. To this effect, biologist Stefano Mancuso coined the term bioinspiration to describe networked and decentralized plant-based models for the design of technologies and social systems. The Plantoid project run by Mancuso and colleagues, its website pictured here, attempts to put the idea of bioinspiration into practice. As we know, plants are our foods, medicines, fibers, decorations, and totems. We breathe with plants every moment of our lives through embodied dialogue. Yet perhaps because of their sessile lifestyles and their uncanny abilities to regenerate, we also tend to forget about plants or relegate them to the categories of disposable things, mute materials, or aesthetic objects. A rapidly growing body of scholarship in CPS aims to reverse these trends. The field poses sharp critiques of long-standing conceptions of plant life in aesthetics, critical theory, ethics, literary studies and language studies, Western literature, ontology and metaphysics, performance and politics, as well as many other areas of culture and philosophy. CPS aims to do for plants what human-animal studies began to do for animal life over 20 years ago. Attributing greater agency and autonomy to the non-human world strengthens the ethical standing of beings historically relegated to the lower rungs of the chain of life. CPS research often pivots towards the field of plant signaling and behavior. This research shows that plants exhibit long-term memory and behavior as part of learning processes. In one study, the sensitive plant, or mimosa as pictured here, stopped closing its leaves when it realized that a repeated disturbance, in this case its being dropped, had no real damaging consequences. Although plants lack brains and neural tissues, they possess complex internal signaling networks. This has led to prominent scientists such as Anthony Trivavas making an empirical case for plant intelligence. Extending ideas of signaling and behavior to the humanities, CPS focuses on the life worlds of plants, including their capacities for intention, sensing, sensation, meaning-making, memory, and forms of experience and expression. In this context, plants are seen as agents acting upon, and indeed transforming, art, culture, literature, politics, and every other human pursuit. So, how can ideas of plant percipience contribute to climate change discourse? I want to take up this question in the context of climate change narratives. For background, the last 5 years have marked a proliferation of climate change fiction, or cli-fi, defined as, quote, stories set in a climatically changed world, describing the human experience of such fictional futures, end quote. Cli-fi considers the psychological impacts of climate change, but also the external effects of social and ecological collapse. The genre thematizes political consequences of climate disturbance, as well as the challenges to human survival that present during this era. It uses recognizable literary forms such as parody, satire, and elegy. Also of note is the emergence of climate change theater, which dramatizes disastrous events in their aftermath. Such performative narratives often navigate the internal psychological dimensions of climate change. In addition to cli-fi and theater, eco-poetry offers an outlet for poets to narrativize climate change. The Keep It in the Ground campaign reflects the belief that poetry can augment the larger climate change narrative circulating in the public. The curator Carol Ann Duffy comments, quote, "Journalists have transmitted the warnings of scientists, but they have sometimes focused too much on the mini controversies and the unimportant disagreements and not enough on the big picture." End quote. In her view, climate change journalism and the science on which it might or should be based can oftentimes disorient readers. This renders the issue oftentimes devoid of emotional or aesthetic content in her assertion. As a response, the 20-day, quote, anthology of poetry on climate change, end quote, features lyrical descriptions by 20 different poets promoting ecological awareness while conveying experiences of mourning, loss, and displacement. But as I argue, despite its laudable intentions, the poetry is distinctly focused on animals. The poems as a whole privilege the perspectives and experiences of humans and other animals, and on occasion water, soil, and rocks, but they simply neglect plants. In further explaining this assertion in light of CPS, let's look at a couple of examples from the anthology. Duffy's poem Parliament is characteristic of this unconscious privileging of animals over plants in climate change narratives. It opens with the lines, "Then in the writer's wood, every bird with a name in the world crowded the leafless trees, took its turn to whistle or croak. An owl grieved in an oak, a magpie mocked, a rook cursed from a sycamore." The poem presents an array of bird voices and affects. Owls grieve, magpies mock, rooks curse, cormorants speak, woodpeckers heckle, hawks swear, nightingales intone. It concludes with the lines, "So snow and darkness slowly fell, the eagle, history in silhouette, with the golden plover and the albatross telling of Arctic ice as the cold, hard moon calved from the earth." So in the poem, birds bear witness to climate change. But cataclysm similarly impacts the language of fish, which is referenced midway through the poem as, quote, "cut out at the root." Interestingly, here, root is used figuratively rather than materially. It's a metaphor for the language of fish. Even the oceans have fallen, quote unquote, mute, implying that they once could vocalize. In contrast, trees such as the oak and sycamore serve as the passive context for the life worlds of zoological subjects. Plants are given no such voice, nor the capacity for percipience or experience. My comments here are not intended as an indictment of Duffy's poem, the campaign, or the genre of eco-poetry. Instead, I'm trying to point out a tendency in poetic works and many other narrative forms to assign plant life to the background. After all, plants can be hard to get to know, and why should poets presume to be able to penetrate the inner lives of plants? Isn't that a kind of pathetic fallacy? The lives of plants are secret, veiled, private, cryptic, and often out of our everyday perception. This is ostensible in Tompkins and Bird's classic book, The Secret Life of Plants from the 70s, and the Stevie Wonder album of the same title, as well as more recent subsequent works on the theme. These kinds of patterns persist in Oswald's hydrological poem Vertigo, a perceptive, delicate, and imaginative interpretation of, quote, the 2-minute life of rain, in which water is animate. And I'll read the introductory lines. May I shuffle forward and tell you the 2-minute life of rain, starting right now, lips open and lidless cold, all-seeing gaze, when something, not yet anything, changes its mind like me. The narrative is interesting for partly telling the story from the water's perspective. In contrast, the poem's references to plants ring as metaphorical or incidental. The rain, quote, sees the garden in its green, in the green of its mind already drinking, and the grass lengthening. What is missing from the narrative is a sense for the ecological cycles linking rain and plants, where both bear perceptive faculties. For, as science is telling us, it is no longer a flight of fancy or transgression against Western ideas for plants to speak, remember, learn, experience excitation, or express pain. I think it's time now for our narratives to begin to engage with and reflect these complex understandings. Yet I also recognize that it's unrealistic to imply that a single narrative instance like a poem should or can do everything. But these brief examples and my abbreviated readings do suggest that the prevailing view of plants, including in the context of climate change, is strangely ambivalent. Plants do appear in our imaginations. We note their flowering, seeding, or dying back. They depart from our consciousness for long periods of time. They become, at times, the mute, unaffected, stalwart backgrounds against which the world's animalistic dramas unfold. We often tend to notice plants in their absence, as this image of a fallen tree in a forest represents. I want to broaden the discussion at this point by thinking about how critical plant studies can shift this situation. Although I list 5 ways here just to limit myself, there are really many, many more to consider. First, I think CPS can help us recast climate change narratives by bringing plants to the foreground as agents with their own modes of adaptation and subjective experiences of environmental disturbances. Second, CPS can ground narratives in the substance of the botanical world. This can help to transform abstracted rhetoric into evocative material reality. The immersive mediation of plants and narratives can mirror back to us our utter interdependence. Third, serious attention to vegetality can introduce sensuousness and the specificities of sensoriality that can help to counterbalance the immense scale of climate change. In this regard, eco-critic Tim Morton describes climate change as a hyperobject, a phenomenon so distributed in time and space that it scrambles perception. Here I am referring to the power of plant sense, tastes, sensations, sounds, and sights to bring us back to Earth, while evoking affective states other than our own. Fourth, plant temporality enables the contemplation of time scales while minimizing the potential for us to become overwhelmed by the real extent of deep time. In this sense, plants become our allies in time. Fifth, plants compel us to consider the dialectics of climate change. That plants are both ancient source and modern sink of carbon suggests a mode of being that can accommodate the messiness of human plant-earth-animal entanglements. Such a dialectics, for lack of a better word, might allow us to conceive of climate change in terms that resist monologic practices and rigid categorizations. So in sum, I want to suggest that the stories circulating in the public imagination about climate change and which provoke debate, action, and reflection, can be enhanced through the invigorated understandings of the plant world offered by critical plant studies. This might include the increased representation of plant life, plant ethics, and vegetal intelligence in climate change narratives, but it also involves something fundamentally different, but related, and that's the intrinsic reshaping of narratives themselves into increasingly vegetal forms. On that note, I'd like to thank you very much for your kind attention. Please keep in touch, and I look forward to your ideas.